further ado, I think I have to give a moment. I would like to introduce our next panelist, Jeffrey Cole.
David, delighted to be here. What a great introduction.
Hello, Jeff. It's so nice to see you. Jeff is the president of the Center for the Digital Future at USC Annenberg School of Communications, and he is a well-known expert worldwide. He founded and directs the World Internet Project, which is a long-term longitudinal look at the effects of computer and internet technology. And that includes a study that is conducted over 35 countries. He regularly consults for the White House, for Congress, for the Department of Defense, and for companies around the world. Jeff, it's wonderful to have you here. It's
great to be here, David.
So let me start off with the question that a question about what I just mentioned, which was your statement in 2019 that traditional media, that the era of traditional media was gone and that the era of digital streaming was here. What did you mean by that?
Well, I was struck at it was the last Emmys in the old world, the 1919 Emmys, the 3 and then 4 broadcast networks, which had dominated the Emmys my whole life. Usually the Emmys were who was going to win the most, ABC, CBS, NBC, or Fox. At that Emmys, the 4 networks collectively won 1 Emmy for programming. So that represented to me the end of the old era of television dominated by the old forces. And on the horizon, 2 months later, were these new streaming services from Disney and Apple TV Plus, which came out within a week of each other. We're building, of course, on what Netflix had done. You know, keep in mind, 10 years ago, Netflix was the red envelope business. His biggest competitor was Blockbuster. And it seems
so interesting, that's right.
And so to me, that was sort of the period when the old era of television ended and the new one began. And just one other thing, you did such a great job, and I'm not just being polite, at talking about how lines had been blurred. Well, the other line that had been blurred and was so clear in that period, the line between film and television is unrecognizable. You know, film always meant bigger stars, although I realize, of course, that SAG-AFTRA, all stars are big, but bigger movie stars, bigger stories, and bigger screen. And of course, all that's meaningless today. Now the biggest stars in the world are making original streaming. The biggest stories, what could be bigger than The Crown? And as far as screens, the movie screen is still bigger, but the average screen at home is 55 inches. So the old era has sort of changed. And that was before COVID, and COVID accelerated everything.
Right. So I love the way that you laid that out, but let me ask, why do I care? I'm a consumer. So we've got these changes going on. Am I happy about this? Am I not happy about this?
For a consumer, you're happy. I mean, of course, we love movie theaters, the best first date experience that, ever invented. But what the consumer has gotten is choice, massive amounts of content watched in their comfortable home where the bathroom's nearby and the food is as healthy or unhealthy as you want it to be. And the cost, I mean, I'm not pushing Netflix, but for $11 to $13 a month to be getting original motion picture quality, hundreds of old series, the consumer is the winner on an economic level. We pay a little bit on a social level, and we've yet to see if movie theaters will come back. That's an important issue.
Right. Well, let's flip that then. What about for working people? Am I happy about this? If you're a prognosticator, what do you think holds the future?
Oh, what's good for the consumer is not always good for the working person. Clearly, it's good for the members of SAG-AFTRA as far as the amount of work. John Landgraf was the one at FX, was the one who charted that 3 years ago, there were 550 scripted presentations, originals in town. That's just burgeoning. There's far more opportunity, but it's not at the same levels. Whether we're going to continue to see actors paid potentially $20 million a film, whether budgets can remain at $200 million films, $200 million per film for some high-end films remains to be seen. So the impact on members of SAG-AFTRA is unclear. The top members will always do well, maybe not quite as well, but where the rest of the membership falls remains to be seen.
One of the things that we get most concerned about at SAG-AFTRA is, as you say, not the top earners, although they too have their challenges in this new world, but the middle class and the potential for hollowing out the middle class. What do you think about that? What's the likelihood, the trend? Is that moving towards hollowing it out, or do you see optimism there?
I'm not terrible. I mean, first of all, the middle class takes their lead from where the upper class is. So we'll see what happens there. But I'm more concerned actually about the immediate effect of people behind the camera being hollowed out. We learned, for example, in the first days of the pandemic, the late night shows, Colbert, Fallon, Kimmel, they went into their homes. It looked like public access television the first 2 weeks. And then they found their groove. They got their orchestras together, their writers, and all of a sudden they were able to produce really quality looking, and I mean looking, shows with crews of 20 people. I worry about whether those other 180 who put it together before the pandemic will ever have long-term jobs. So I think that's where the hollowing out. You still need your members on screen. Nothing replaces that. The question is what they're going to be paid. And I will see. There may be some adjustments. I hope not, but I don't think it's going to be a calamity for SAG-AFTRA members. It could be a calamity for below the line people.
Well, we're concerned about everyone, so I don't like to hear you say that, but I will say that I'm happy to hear that prognostication for performers. So we'll take each positive that we can. We talk about how media is fragmenting, and we have all of these platforms now. Do you see those as continuing to expand, or do you think there's a limit to the expansion, or even snapping back, and some of these will collapse and turn into larger conglomerates, but fewer platforms?
Well, to consumers, to viewers, we don't watch platforms. We watch shows. Right. And, I was brought up when everything was network television, and then cable came along. And you talk to, back when I used to teach, you talk to my students, they made no distinction between broadcast networks and cable. And now they make no distinction between broadcast and cable and streaming. It's all content. You follow the content. That's why I've been saying, it's sort of a cliche now, I've been saying for years, that we all grew up with content is king. Well, content is kinger than it has ever been. We follow the content. So yes, there will be new platforms. We won't know where they come from. It's amazing, the platforms that have disappeared. The VCR changed my life. Television on demand. Well, that's been dead 15 years. And the DVD not far behind. So we don't know where the platforms will come from, but we watch great content. And that's what really put Netflix in place, when they could go beyond reruns and start offering great content. They're starting with House of Cards, and now, truly motion picture quality content. We go where the content is. Disney built Disney Plus on The Mandalorian, which many people enjoyed far more than the Star Wars movies in the theater.
It's great. It's a great point. How many platforms do you have right now, Jeff?
I still have television, of course, broadcast and cable. I'm an old guy, and I have about 3 streaming services.
About 3.
And my belief is, I don't want to be jargony in this, but what's become known as SVOD. SVOD's just, all of the streaming is video on demand. That's the VOD. The S is the subscription. The streaming services, you pay a monthly fee. Netflix, Disney, Hulu, now HBO Max, although HBO Max is a special case. Maybe we'll get to that. And I believe there's only a market for about 2.5. I think we're going to pay for about 2.5, which is why NBC Universal decided it was too competitive trying to get into that 2.5. And they created Peacock as what we call an AVOD, an advertising video on demand. There is a pay package for Peacock. The evidence is nobody wants to pay. So it's really an advertising supported. And I think that's where the growth is going to be. But I subscribe to 3 SVOD services. And then later we can talk a little bit about PVOD, which is largely happened because of the pandemic, when studios had movies they couldn't put in the theater, and they were too much money wrapped up in the movie, and they didn't want to sell them to streaming services for the subscription. So they charged starting at $20 just to watch the one movie, sort of and that's a work in progress.
All those acronyms can be difficult. The main ones, SVOD, which is subscription, like Netflix. There's TVOD, which is transactional, like Apple. There is AVOD, which is advertising based, like CBS All Access. Is there another main one, just so that the audience knows?
Other than the PVOD, and of course CBS All Access in this world is about to become Paramount Plus. I know the Plus label seems to have stuck. Peacock got ribbed for what a silly name for the channel, and I came to their defense saying, all Disney and Apple did was add a Plus, and all HBO did was add a Max. But Plus seems to be the winning term.
That's right. Let me switch gears a little bit to talk about algorithms, and which is in the common lingo, but can be scary for those of us who are trying to understand where technology is headed, and how we as consumers are unwittingly shaped into certain decisions as a result of algorithms. So if I pull up, if I search for a television show, or if I search for something on just a Google search, what comes up on my screen will be different than what comes up on your screen, because these algorithms are figuring out who I am and what my interests are, et cetera. In media, these algorithms give us particular television shows. They recommend certain shows, and there can be bias built in to that. What are your thoughts about algorithms, and what are your thoughts about our ability to know their impact and to shape their impact, as opposed to simply being victims of them?
Well, we have to be careful about revealing too much, or we'll become enemies of Amazon and Google, and you know what can happen there. But we learned when we first started using the internet that we'd enter something into Google, and then miraculously a half hour later, there would be an advertisement for the thing that we looked at. Yeah. Now, sometimes that was incredibly convenient. You would then see Amazon show you the product that you looked up at a discount. Algorithms in media the casebook study that they're looking at the Harvard Business School is Netflix. Netflix decided after they moved out of the red envelope business, within a couple of years, they wanted to do what HBO did, was move into original production. HBO built its reputation not on showing movies that had been in the theater 3 months earlier, but on Sopranos and Sex and the City. So Netflix wanted to do that. They were willing to spend a tremendous amount of money on their first or second production. Their first was actually something called Lilyhammer, which was not that successful. But they looked at all the data they collected from Netflix users. Now, some of this may be urban legend, and some of this may be rewriting of truth, but according to Netflix, they found that people's favorite director on things that they were watching on Netflix was David Fincher, who directed Seven and The Social Network. One of their favorite actors, this is a different era, was Kevin Spacey. And one of, not their favorite, but one of the better reviewed and liked television series was the British television series House of Cards. And allegedly, Netflix used that data to put Fincher and Spacey together, make House of Cards, and the rest is sort of history. But that's what algorithms can be used to find out what people watch, because with broadcast networks, you only had ratings, numbers. This can really find out where people go back to repeatedly. And as with the Google or Amazon, used properly, it can create entertainment and guide us to entertainment we like. It can know us better than us, but it is also revealing an awful lot about ourselves.
You know, Jeff, can you tap your camera a little bit? You went a little blurry.
Oh, I'm sorry. I apologize for that if I cover.
That's all right. You are there. Yes, that's better. You tell us, you are a visionary about media. You're not actually a media professional yourself, so it's no worries. You know, it's interesting, these business models, along the lines of what you were just saying, now are looking for niche audiences. They're looking for audiences that want to see particular content, as opposed to in the past, a network that had a show in prime time had to try to get to as many people as possible. So one show would be made for millions and millions of eyeballs, and those shows had to often be watered down to the lowest common denominator to ensure that it was attractive to as many people as possible. Now it's flipped, which is product is made for Jeff Cole, which is different product that might be made for David White. And while that is, I guess that is part of the positive potential for the future, stories that are more relevant to increasingly diverse audiences, whether we're talking about traditional lines of diversity, race, class, gender, et cetera, or just an explosion in storytelling. And the business model seems to embrace the possibility of that and to give us real potential for that. Does that sound right to you?
It sounds very right, and it's one of the great strengths of streaming. Broadcast networks wanted mass accumulation of audience. The only exceptions were kids' television on Saturday morning, news interview shows Sunday morning. And the ones who saw that weakness was cable, who was able to create channels just for young kids, teenagers, Black entertainment television, Latino, old programming for older users. But cable has this luxury that Netflix or Disney, 4 people in the household can be watching the same channel on different sets, and the young kids are watching the early development programming on Netflix. The teenagers are watching reruns of Friends for 100th time. The parents are watching dramas, and the grandparents are watching whatever they like. It's one, just as the networks served everybody, but they had to serve them by homogenizing the content. Netflix and the other streamers can serve everybody very specifically. This is where the consumer wins. The choice, the incredible choice. You know, the only choice we had in the first 50 years of television was ABC, CBS, or NBC. Those choice, now we have total choice.
And what do you think of this idea that I focused on a little bit in my speech, which is we have more choice, but that choice, you just mentioned all of that coming from one company, Netflix, or all of it could come from Amazon or any of these other companies. The collapse of the traditional lines from a producer and a distributor and an exhibitor, does it mean anything? Is that something that we need to be concerned about?
Sure, it means something. It means when one company gains too much control, we're seeing that they can exert influence and change the market in unnatural ways. We're seeing this discussion with the tech companies, the FANGs you mentioned. Yesterday, I think what Facebook did in Australia was a brutal display of arrogance when you control the market by essentially cutting news off to an entire continent. And that's what can happen when you don't really have competition. And, you know, we've grown up in a 3-network environment, a 6-studio environment, and there has been enough competition to give producers a choice, to support exhibitors. That's all collapsing. And if Netflix, as the most powerful one today, controls the market, they set prices, they begin to influence whether people's ideas get seen and in what shape. So that's always frightening. And I should add, you know, that coming out of the pandemic, we can talk about what happened in the pandemic, but coming out of the pandemic, Netflix is the most powerful entertainment company in the history of the entertainment industry. No one company has ever dominated entertainment the way that Netflix does right now.
So, you know, you and I have had this conversation before. I guess, and I continue to hear this notwithstanding what you've just said. Netflix doesn't do anything other than content. Unlike Apple, which builds phones and does other things, and Amazon, which sells you books and has a cloud service, Netflix just does content, and they get their money from subscribers. Why is this not a Ponzi scheme? They just keep getting more subscribers. At some point, they're going to run out of subscribers here in the United States. They're expanding internationally, but the languages are different. How is it that Netflix has become so powerful and their market share is so great when they're just earning their money from people paying $11 or $12, whatever you have a month?
Well, they may hit a ceiling on how much they can grow. I don't think they're there yet. But in their defense, they're not a Ponzi scheme, because eventually the Ponzi scheme has taken money from so many people and can't deliver back to the late entries into the Ponzi scheme. Netflix delivers. Netflix delivers a great value for every single one of their subscribers. And when I say great value, I just mean the amount of content. So a new subscriber does not get less than an original subscriber. So it's not a Ponzi scheme. It may just be a growth company that gets to the point where it can't grow anymore. And incidentally, as huge as Netflix is, they could easily get bought. I mean, they are still a small player compared to, you know, the FANGs you had talked about. You know, Rupert Murdoch, the most important guy in the last 20 years of the entertainment business, decided he couldn't compete against trillion-dollar companies, couldn't compete against Apple and Facebook and Google. And he sold out because he knew he couldn't compete. And we could easily see Netflix become a part of Apple. It's not AT&T, a $200 billion company, bought a couple of years ago Time Warner for $85 billion. So $200 billion company buying an 85. So a $2 trillion company could pay $350 million for Netflix or Disney. And not even, you wouldn't even see a bulge as they were digesting it. So they may end up as divisions of even bigger companies.
That's so interesting. And so I want to make sure that we've established at least a couple of headlines. We are not saying that Netflix is a Ponzi scheme. In fact, you've just said Netflix is not a Ponzi scheme.
It's not a
Let's make sure
Ponzi
that that's
scheme.
the headline. That's right. And you mentioned AT&T. I find it so interesting. AT&T has now jumped into the content game in such a real way with HBO Max and with Warner Brothers, et cetera. And as you say, they've been in the content game. They've been in media, of course, for such a long time. But do you think that there will continue to be mergers of companies whose core business is something outside of media, like Apple and phones or Amazon, where they come in a very big way to create content and then either use the content for content purposes, or they're just using that as part of a larger business model where content becomes just a feeder into a larger business?
I think it's the latter, and it's been going on. In the 1960s, the movie studios were all in two businesses: movies and television. The only exception was Disney, which had theme parks. But then they all got bought up, not all, but most of them, by bigger entities, by Gulf and Western, who bought Paramount, by Rupert Murdoch, a newspaper publisher who ended up buying Fox, almost all NBC, and Universal, which got bought first, NBC by General Electric, Vivendi, but ends up at Comcast. So I think that absolutely continues. Some of them are really interested in entertainment and media. To others, they're just good investments.
It's funny, we tend to think of ourselves as being right here at the dawn of something that is new and unprecedented. And what you just said suggests that this is just an extension of trends that we've seen for many years. Do you think we are in a new place, that this is unprecedented? And what makes this different, if you do?
Well, going back to the 60s, when I said they were in two businesses, the danger was one really disastrous big budget film and the studio could fold. In 1977, Columbia let it be known they had a $30 million investment in Close Encounters of the Third Kind. And they said if Close Encounters bombed, that was the end of the studio. Fortunately, it didn't. But UA made Heaven's Gate several years later, had to sell. Coca-Cola, who owned Columbia, made Ishtar. They didn't like the returns, they got out. So the good part of that was the companies became bigger and one film couldn't make or break a studio. There's protection in being owned by a $1 trillion company. But the other side of that development is one of the $1 trillion companies, the smartest of all of them. I think there are the geniuses in the world, and then there's Jeff Bezos. Amazon decided we don't want to buy a studio. We'll start our own. Well, we don't need a big studio lot. We can go rent one. I think you're going to see more of that. I think less takeover of existing and more building of their own. And it's interesting if you look at the path Verizon is taking as opposed to AT&T. AT&T bought one of the best studio brands in the world. Verizon doesn't want to build a studio or buy a studio.
They're going to focus on 5G, among other things. So we're entering the last couple of questions. I want to talk with you a little bit just about AI, and your own studies have taken you outside of media to look at the technological shifts that are happening with automated automobiles and healthcare, et cetera. It still seems to me that so many of these companies that are using technology in so many different ways are attracting consumers through media and through content. I'm just curious. I guess my question is this relationship that technology and artificial intelligence and algorithms and media seems like it's increasingly going to be woven into the fabric of other parts of our economy. Does that sound right to you?
It already is. You know, all of a sudden there's a chip shortage and automobiles can't be made because this is happening literally right now. You know, one of the coming global conflicts is going to be over chip production. AI's extraordinary. We use it. I mean, anyone who has an Amazon Alexa or a Google Home is using crude AI. It is very exciting, even though Elon Musk, a man I have immense respect for, the Edison of the 21st century, he says it's the greatest danger to mankind there is ahead of nuclear war. But I'm fairly optimistic about technology. You see that I said the consumer is winning in media. The only area I am a genuine pessimist, and Gabrielle covered this really well in her introduction, is the future of work. We see 50 million jobs disappearing over the next generation. McKinsey says 850 million globally. Every driver job is on a path to elimination. Every checker job is on a slow path. And just, briefly, in 1900, in America, 4 million people made their living through horses. Blacksmiths, carriage makers, people who cleaned up after horses. Today, about 45,000 do. But historically, the new industry, in this case, automobile production, creates more jobs than the old industry loses. Not this time. We've never seen jobs fully rebound from the big recession. They're not going to come fully back after the pandemic. And I worry because if we're left with lots of unemployed people, and if we had guaranteed basic income, that only solves the do I eat problem. It's still what's my purpose in life. But if these problems aren't addressed, we're looking at depression, drug abuse, suicide, even potentially civil unrest. I warned you, this is the one area I'm not optimistic about.
All right, and we have to go, but we
what
can't
a great
leave it at
note
that.
to end it on.
Give me one optimistic, very quick nugget on that. What do we do about that? It's not universal basic income. Give me one other thing that we can leave our audience with to have them smile as opposed to start crying.
Well, let's talk about SAG-AFTRA. I don't think you're a deep fakes aside. I don't. You're in one of the professions that really are not going to be replaced by AI. We fall in love with actors. We want to know all about them. We follow them from film to film. I think you're safe from that. I can't say that to all the people I talk to, but I think your future is pretty bright.
We'll leave it at that for now. Jeff, thank you very much for joining us today. And thanks for all the work that you do. And Gabrielle, I'm going to pass this back to you.
David, thank you very much.
That was a great conversation. Thank you, David and Jeff. It was really riveting. You were so clear. And thank you for actually having the discussion about opportunities that streaming presents for our members. And it's very helpful. So I hope you're right on that. Really good conversation. Thank you.